I think about it as like LLM rot. These models are trained on the corpus of, whatever's out there on the internet. And yeah, you could pay a farm of people to go generate misinformation, and people did, right? Like, oh, go write these blog posts that have these mistruths because I'm going to try to sway public opinion on some topic that's important to me. But it was somewhat limited because you had to pay people to sit there and type this content and generate the misinformation. But now we just have generative AI that can generate an infinite amount of misinformation and pollute the internet with, it might be that 99.9999% of what's on the internet is pure misinformation, AI generated. Yeah, but, and then that gets used to train the next generation of LLMs. So how does that feedback?
That always has been the case. I mean, I remember, so when one of the unsung heroes in the whole AI space is the common crawl. I mean, it's a foundation, and I believe there work like 2 people or something. It's like very tiny. But back in the day when we were working with Glove, and then we trained on like the Wikipedia, so we had this idea like, yeah, let's take some of these WARC files and then train on a bigger data set. Let's just see what happens, right? Again, I'm talking like literally like 9 years ago now or something, right? When we were like working at that late at night, at some point we had like this drinking game where you had like, shots, right? And you took a WARC file from the common crawl, and then you just typed in a random line in that file. And so if the content was in one shape or form pornographic, then you had to drink the shot.
Oh, no.
You were drunk in a heartbeat because the amount of crap those crawlers is insane. Yeah. You are describing a dystopian state of 99% of the web being crap. I think 99% of the web already is like a lot of crap, right? So it's like it's actually the great work that the people are doing to try to figure out, like filter out, like what's actually good information, what's bad information.
Okay, but what if OpenAI is able, just yesterday they inked a deal with News Corp to license News Corp's information, so they can use, Wall Street Journal and whatever, Dow Jones, and like these news sources that News Corp owns. But News Corp is one news company. They're biased. All news sources have a bias, right? They're biased in one direction. But say the New York Times won't license their stuff to OpenAI. So does OpenAI become inherently biased because they're only able to license and use certain information?
I think actually that that what happened with the GPT models that introduced a flaw in the thinking. So if I may slightly alter the direction of the conversation to make another point that comes back to what you're asking, is that what happened with GPT was that there were 2 camps, right? Camp number 1 was we just need to train it on more data, and camp 2 was that will not work. And camp 1 clearly won, right? So it's like, hey, so especially also with companies like OpenAI, it's like, if you give me $1 billion, I'll train on a huge corpus and it will be better. If you give me $10 billion, I just train on a larger corpus and it will even be better. Well, you see the pattern that's starting to emerge here, right? And even 50 billion, and so on and so forth.
But they haven't found the point of diminishing return yet.
No, not yet. But, well, depends how you look at it. Because if you look, for example, going from the first GPT models, so that Gödel model, for example, from Microsoft, to the first GPT model, and then going from 1 to 2 was already so much better, but not the same delta. Going from 2 to 3 is so much better, not the same delta. It's like it's already starting to slowly curve up. And so there's like a lot of people now that also are starting to ask.
So you don't think GPT-4 is 10 times better than GPT-3?
Yes. And so what people are already doing is asking themselves the question, like, do we need to take a step back? And do we need to rethink how we use language in these models? And there are even people now trying to make them completely absent of knowledge, right? So that there's language understanding and relation in language, but with the least amount of knowledge as possible, right? So that you have an external knowledge source. I believe that the original RAG paper actually, that's what they describe, right? So how can we create a model that is where they use actually 2 models, right? An encoder and I'm blanking on the name of the models, but they use 2 models and they what they're basically saying, like, so one is used for encoding, and on retrieval we use the other one to generate tokens. And that the concept basically is like, can we have the knowledge outside of the models, right? And so that you go to smaller models with a very, very, very basic world understanding who rely on external sources to predict new tokens.
So the training the models is a lot cheaper because they're so much smaller but hyper-specialized?
Yeah, and you want to have accuracy based on so you cannot use that model without an external data source. It's completely useless.
Because you have to feed in context in the
Yes.
context window to make it useful.
Exactly. That is something that I'm very bullish on, right? And these models will probably be significantly smaller. So the point I'm trying to make with this is that I'm just not convinced that training on even more data, trying to get to even more data sources is gonna resolve that issue. I think it's way more gonna be more in sophistication in how these models are being trained. And I mean, luckily, because that kind of goes out of my realm of expertise, of course, because we sit in that storage and retrieval layer. But the point I'm trying to make is that if I had to make a bold prediction like a year from now, we're not going to have bigger models. We're going to have smaller models that rely on external retrieval.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because you can only get so far by having one model that has everything.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, do you want to capture the knowledge in the model? All the problems that you were just describing, which are very funny things, there was not a problem in the language understanding or the coherency of language generation from the models. It was in the knowledge that sat in the model.
Right. And using a corpus that had things that were untrue or misinformation.
If you then use retrieval, you can just say, you must base the results you're going to produce on the following information that I'm going to give you. Then you, as an end user, present it with information that is correct, right? So that's very different. And the problem that Google needs to deal with is that the use case that they have is the web. That's the Google use case. The Google use case.
Indexing all human knowledge, yeah.
Point that I'm trying to get across is like, I've seen these examples too, and I thought they were funny too.
Yeah.
But the problem is not the model not hallucinating and generating coherent results. The problem was the input data where the knowledge comes from is wrong. But we could have imagined that if...
But do you have to have a human sit there and classify each thing as like, that's true, that's not true, that's misinformation, that's bias, that's, like how do you solve that problem at scale? I mean, that's a very hard problem.
That's a very hard problem because then we go into the realm of what's true and what's not.
Exactly. Now you're back into the philosophers.
Yes, and I love to talk about that, but I'm the risk you run with it is that you find yourself in a political discussion, right, or a moral discussion. But the point that I'm trying to make is if we try to abstract that away, we can just say that the models, assuming that the information that we're giving it is like a priori true, it does a pretty good job of rendering something, right? And sometimes it still hallucinates, where it just does wrong token prediction.
Yeah. But you think that will be solved?
Yeah, by making it by abstracting it from the knowledge it has. So let me give you an interesting example where that still goes wrong in older models. So let's say that you want to do RAG, and one of the data objects you have in database is something extraordinary happened. There's like this. People have been able to transport the Eiffel Tower from Paris to Berlin. So now the Eiffel Tower is in Berlin. With the older models, so for example, GPT-2, that's open source value. If you do RAG with that older model, then a conflict starts to emerge in what it renders because you give it as, the question might be, what significant event or significant thing happened with the Eiffel Tower? From your database, it will retrieve that right information, right? So now you have that little article that says like, the Eiffel Tower is like, what an exciting thing. They moved it from the Paris to Berlin. The model will have a little bit of a conflict because of the knowledge that it has in the model, because it has so much data that the Eiffel Tower really is in Paris, right? That it might result things like, well, the Eiffel Tower was moved to Berlin, but it's probably not true because it's really in Paris and that kind of stuff. It might render something like that.
It's conflicted, yeah.
It's conflicted. That's an example where we just want to actually remove that information from that knowledge from the model, and that it's actually better to have less information and knowledge in the model, but just the language understanding, right? That it understands that there's so those kind of things are more tricky. And it's interesting to see that in these RAG pipelines. But I really believe that an external data source plus smaller model with language understanding and less knowledge, so that we do not rely on the knowledge in the model, but in whatever we give it from an external source, that's the future, I think.